Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Environmental Justice Now. This is our September 10th edition, and today we're going to talk about climate change and forced migration. We welcome you to our broadcast from Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. We broadcast every Friday. And we encourage you to invite your friends and family to watch our broadcast, as we highlight environmental justice issues. My name is Ralph Hodge, and I'm the Faith Outreach Manager at Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. And before we do any broadcasts, every week we do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this land that we're on was possessed by indigenous people before us. And so we are in the place called so-called Richmond, but this land is originally the land of the Powhatans and the Chickahominy people. And so we acknowledge that land. And if you want to know the land that you are on and acknowledge that land, you can go to www.native/land.ca, and you can find out the native lands that you reside on at this present moment. Well, today our subject is climate change and forced migration. Good afternoon. So if you have watched any of our shows in the past, you are familiar with climate change, but you may not be as familiar with how climate change causes millions around the globe to permanently flee from their homelands. In April of this year, the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees released data showing that the number of people displaced by climate change related disasters since 2010 has risen to 21.5 million people, pointing out that in addition to what we call sudden disasters, climate change is a complex cause of food and water shortages, as well as difficulties in accessing natural resources. The term climate refugee was first coined to describe the increasingly large-scale migration and cross-border mass movement of people that were partly caused by weather-related disasters. And I'm going to ask that our team show our first slide today, and this is from the United Nations. And this slide shows that there are approximately 272 million migrants in the world. 25.9 million were forcibly displaced, or what we call now refugees. 2/3 of all international migrants live in G20 countries. In 2017, there were about 18.8 million new disaster-related internal folk displaced by climate change. But experts project that that number could rise to 143 million people displaced due to climate change by 2050. Well, that would leave that now that would make a total of over 200 million folk to a billion folk, million migrants are displaced by climate change by 2050. Wow, that is a huge number. Today, only 1% of the world lives in what we call an unlivable hot zone. But experts project that by 2070, that number could grow to nearly 20%. From 1% to 20% is a huge increase. According to a path-breaking recent study in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the planet could see a greater temperature increase in the next 50 years than it did in the last 6,000 years combined. So by 2070, the kind of extremely hot zones like the Sahara that now cover less than 1% of the Earth's land surface could cover nearly a fifth of the land, potentially placing one of every 3 people alive outside the climate niche where humans have thrived for thousands of years. One of every 3. Wow. Many will have to dig in, suffering through the heat, hunger, and political chaos that this will cause. But others will be forced to become climate refugees and move on to other places. A 2017 study in science advances found that by 2100, temperatures could rise to the point that just going outside for a few hours in some places, including parts of India and eastern China, will result in death even for the fittest humans. If it's not a drought and crop failures that force large numbers of people to flee, it will be rising sea levels. Sea level rise is another terrible threat facing our planet. Over the past 30 years, the number of people living in coastal areas at high risk of rising sea levels has increased from 160 million to 260 million people, 90% of whom are from poor, developing countries with small island states. We are now learning that climate scientists have been underestimating the future displacement from rising tides by a factor of 3, with the likely toll being some 150 million people globally. New projections show high tides almost submersing Vietnam by 2050, including most of the Mekong Delta, which is now home to 18 million people. In Bangladesh, it is predicted that 17% of the country will be submerged by the rise of sea level by 2050, and 20 million people living there will lose their homes. And it's not just in parts of China and Thailand. Most of southern Iraq and nearly all of the Nile Delta in Egypt could be submerged. Many coastal regions, even in the United States, are also at risk. I want to show you a slide that talks about and shows where areas of drought, coastal flooding, and hurricanes affect our globe. As you can see to the left, which you see Africa, you see in the middle, the yellow is listing and shows all of the hot zones and hot places. This is based in 2005. It's worse now. And you can see almost on every continent, there's a heat zone. And then in the middle of our graph, you see areas that are exposed to hurricanes on a regular basis. And those areas are now continually being threatened by coastal flooding. And also, of course, you see areas where at the top of our graph in our Arctic areas that are vulnerable to permanent permafrost melting. Wow, we are in terrible straits with regards to climate. And when we see these climate changes and these climate disasters, what we realize is people in these areas will no longer be able to live there, and they are forced to migrate to other areas. So what is being done? Rebecca Martin from the University Network of Human Rights writes in a recent article, the International Refugee Assistance Project released a report on the actions that President Biden can make on his own without congressional approval to address climate change displacement. Several key climate and refugee organizations have endorsed the report, including the Natural Resource Defense Council, University Network for Human Rights, the Mayor's Migration Council, and the Truman National Security Project, Amnesty International, and Welcoming America. Climate displacement is a huge global challenge, said Emma Francis, Climate Displacement Project Strategist for the International Refugee Assistance Project. She says there are concrete things that the U.S. government can do and are existing laws that the U.S. can build upon to make sure that all climate displaced people have a safe place to live. The report published by the International Refugee Assistance Project comes as the Biden administration is preparing to release its own report on climate displacement in the coming weeks. The report calls on the Department of Justice to issue an opinion that clarifies that climate change serves as grounds for refugee status under current United States law. In addition, the report calls on Biden's administration to issue policy guidance for immigration officers and judges on assessing climate-related claims. The Biden administration should also adopt temporary protection status for countries whose citizens are seeing the effects of climate change, such as Guatemala, the report said. The United States awards temporary protection status to individuals from eligible countries who are facing political conflict or natural disasters, and allows people from those eligible countries to live and work in the United States. But one of the reasons for this lack of clear definition of climate refugees is the absence of international organizations and institutions that have failed to clarify what a climate refugee is. But we're hoping that that changes. And this climate refugee issue is not just in far off places. As Leah pointed out in last week's show, flooding is displacing many in our own countries and not just in the coastal areas. Of course, we are remembering just last week the devastation that Hurricane Ida wreaked in our country. But we can't forget that was almost on the anniversary of Katrina. And when we think about the pictures of Katrina, we remember people standing in knee-high water and whole blocks and whole neighborhoods flooded. And I remember those times, people there, I know people that still live in Richmond today who were displaced from Katrina. They were originally from Louisiana and still have not been able to go back to their homes years later. So it is crucial that we elevate the discussion of climate change and climate justice, because it's about community. When we talk about those who are forced to migrate from political reasons, or what our discussion is today about climate change, it forces us to face the idea, who is our neighbor? And what will we do? And how will we help? We must see those who are forced from their homelands as neighbors. We must see them as part of our community, to love, to help, to support, to give resources to lend a helping hand. Because our world is not about tribalism and separation, but it should be about unity. It should be about us seeking to help one another, especially someone who's dealing with a refugee crisis. And so that kind of pivots on what we want to do today as a way of action. Refugees face many obstacles, and not just refugees from climate change. Here at Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, we seek to demonstrate love to all, and especially those who are facing tremendous life challenges that refugees often face. If you've been following the news between Zoom calls and Google meetings, you know about the refugee situation in Afghanistan. Now, this isn't an environmental issue, but it is an issue that is dear to our heart at VAIPL, because our very own steering committee vice chair, Aliyah Farouk, is heading up the effort to help those refugees from Afghanistan resettle. And I want to bring to our show today, Sister Aliyah Farouk, our vice chair of our steering committee. Aliyah, I want you to tell us a little bit about the resettlement efforts that are taking place and what your role is, and also tell us how we can help today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Reverend Hodge, and thank you so much for the wonderful information that you just gave everyone. That was very informative. Yes, so I am the refugee chair at the Islamic Center of Virginia. So we established this committee. I think it's been about 7 to 8 years now. And at the time, we were dealing with a lot of Syrian refugees. And there are many theories that the Syrian refugee crisis was due to climate change. There was a drought right before the unrest began in Syria. So that was a very educational time for me. I was learning more about climate change and climate refugees. Since then, as you know, our previous administration that was in office, they had pretty much shut down the refugees coming into the country. There were some, but they were very few in number, and almost none from Muslim countries were allowed to come in. Because of that, we actually suffered here in Richmond because we had 3 major agencies that were helping us to resettle refugees coming into the Richmond area. One of them is Commonwealth Catholic Charities. I think some may be familiar with that particular organization. We also have the International Refugee Committee. And the third one that we ended up losing a couple of years ago due to the lack of refugees coming into Richmond was Church World Services. They had to close their doors because of the policies of the previous administration and the lack of refugees coming in. The closest office they have now to us is in Charlottesville, unfortunately. So currently, we are facing quite a crisis. The number of refugees coming in right now, not only to Richmond or to Virginia, but even at one time to the United States, in my understanding is that it's quite unprecedented. And it's very humbling to see the love and outpouring of support from the community within Virginia and within the United States, but even internationally to help during this crisis. As far as the situation here in Richmond, I can elaborate a little bit by saying that, as I said, we do have the two agencies helping to resettle, Catholic Charities and International Refugee Committee. We have a third agency called Reestablish Richmond that doesn't help with the initial resettlement process, but they do help the refugees after once they've gotten settled and their paperwork is complete. They do help them with many different things, and they primarily focus on transportation. They help them understand the public transportation system. They help people get their learner's permits. They help people with driving lessons and ultimately getting training, learning how to work with the DMV in the area, and ultimately getting their driver's licenses and vehicles so they can get to work. Because as you know, even if you are able to find a job, if you don't have a vehicle to get to your job, you won't be able to hold on to that job very long. So that is another agency that is doing wonderful work, and we've been working with all three of these agencies for almost a decade now, and it's been an absolutely wonderful experience. Currently, I think it would be worth mentioning that all three of these agencies are worthy of any donations. My understanding is they're taking monetary donations right now. All agencies are being overwhelmed with in-kind donations, boxed gifts. It's very kind of the community to send those in and ship so many wonderful items to these organizations. But logistically, it's becoming a little bit difficult. And that's why these organizations are asking for monetary donations. Similarly, so is the Islamic Center of Virginia. We are asking for monetary donations. And the way we help resettlement is after these agencies have helped the refugees initially for the first 3 months, basically the support that they provide is for 3 months, especially the monetary support. And I think there's some services they provide for up to 6 months, but it's not monetary at that point. We come in at that point at the Islamic Center of Virginia. If for some reason someone is not able to have a job by that point, or unable to keep their job, or has fallen ill, as you know, many jobs in Virginia do not offer paid sick days or anything like that. And sometimes people end up losing these jobs. So we help with unpaid rent for a month or two, medical issues, various issues with children, and even sometimes we've been able to help with families who are looking into getting vehicles. We've been able to help them purchase vehicles. So there's many different ways that we've helped in the past. And quite frankly, the situation is so fluid right now. We're not exactly sure what the situation is going to be for our refugees coming in right now. They are, for the most part, they haven't started the resettlement process yet. The majority of them are housed at military bases, at least here in Virginia. They're primarily being sent out to 3 different states. They're coming into Virginia, they're coming into Texas, and they're coming into California. And I can speak to the situation here in Virginia, and I can tell you that they're being housed at 3 military bases within Virginia. One of them is Quantico. We have one here close to Richmond, being Fort Lee, and the other, which is not too far from Richmond, is Fort Pickett. They also have some housed at the Expo Center in close to Dulles Airport. And in fact, I'm finding out that the ones housed there have legal permanent resident status. Therefore, they don't even qualify for any government assistance at all. So they are in quite a bit of debt once they get here, because my understanding is that their airplane or their airfare and any hotel stays that they have to stay at while they are being processed will be put upon them, and they will have a significant amount of debt on them. So that is another area. I know certain organizations are trying to fundraise just for those refugees. So I don't have the information on any links or any donation sites for those particular refugees, but I do have some information on where you can donate or volunteer here in the Richmond area. And I think they're going to put that in the chat. Reverend Hodge, if you could kindly do that, I would greatly appreciate it. But again, at the Islamic Center of Virginia, at this time, we are only taking monetary donations. And if you can go to the website, which is ICVA1, hit the donate button, and then there will be a category that you have to select. And under that category, if you could kindly select the refugee tab, then we know exactly where you want the funds to go. These funds will ultimately help the refugees resettle in the Richmond area. And all monetary donations are extremely appreciated. Every family's needs are going to be very unique and very different. We don't know how exactly, how or what exactly they're going to need, but monetary donations give us the flexibility to help them with their unique situation. So, whatever you can do, that would be greatly appreciated. For those who cannot help with monetary donations or would like to help in other ways, my understanding is that Commonwealth Catholic Charities, IRC, and CCC are always looking for volunteers. So there's a process to become a volunteer. If you go to their websites, you can look up that information as well. Reverend Hodges, was there anything else that you'd like me to touch base on?
Wow, I think you summarized it quite succinctly. And I think the important thing that we want to take away is, because the situation is fluid, flexibility is key. And so by giving monetary donations, it does allow these agencies the flexibility to tailor the needs and the resources exactly to what folk really require. And so I thank you for letting us know about those volunteer opportunities and those places where we can send our monetary donations. In my faith tradition, we say God loves a cheerful giver. And I encourage people to cheerfully give to support our brothers and sisters in this refugee crisis. Mrs. Farouk, I appreciate you coming on today. I know you're super busy because you've just been overwhelmed by this task that you've been charged with. And our prayers are with you. And we're going to encourage our listeners to volunteer and to give to help take off some of that load, because I know you're super busy. I want to thank everyone for coming on and following us today on our show and our broadcast. Join us next week for Environmental Justice Now. You can always join us by going to our website, and there's the link right there, join VAIPL. Feel free to make any kind of donations if you would like to support our environmental justice efforts as we elevate the discussion in the Commonwealth of Virginia of environmental justice issues. We thank you for tuning into us today, and we will see you again next week. And Mrs. Farouk, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much.